Welcome to the Rehydrate interview series, a forum for the discussion of Leo Shishin's Remembrance of Earth's Past series. Each episode, I'll be speaking with a guest about their thoughts and experiences on reading the series. Spoiler warning for listeners, this episode will contain spoilers for all of the Three-Body Problem, The Dark Forest, Death's End, and any other media we happen to discuss. My name is Dan, and today I'm joined by Thalia. Welcome, Thalia.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for joining. So yeah, let's just start with a little background on yourself.
Sure. I picked up the Three Body Problem. I was actually on my bookshelf for a while, but what sparked my interest is when I got the opportunity to travel and live in China for a
Mm,
little bit of time and realized just how narrow my cultural worldview was on Chinese exports and how I had not seen like science fiction. And I turned back and really found myself drawn in by Three Body, particularly because I tried reading it before in the Cultural Revolution introduction, which, if you haven't read it in a while or if you haven't read it at all, it does take up like a good 80 pages or so of the first book.
yeah.
That was a real stumbling block for me the first time. So I came back with fresh eyes and then pretty much devoured the whole Remembrance of Earth's Past series. That was my background introduction to the book.
Yeah, I had the same experience when I read the book for the first time because like I picked it up as I just was looking for some hard sci-fi book.
Hmm.
And so I had a long drive ahead of me and I picked up the audiobook and I started listening to it and I was like, what? Where's the sci-fi in this book? But I had a very long drive, so I just kept plugging on. I was like, oh, okay, I get it, I get it, I get it. And then especially at the end, you kind of see how it all kind of ties together. So
The hard science fiction aspect can be like kind of polarizing for readers. Like, are you someone who like what's your tolerance for hard sci-fi? You're like, yes, this helps fill out the worldview, or like, no, I've heard enough about how we drag asteroids.
actually, I'm not a huge reader, but the promise of hard sci-fi was interesting enough to me where I just kept through it. So yeah, like I like all like the technical details and like the more scientific explanations behind everything. So yeah, like it drew me into the story even more, I think, and it's like world building in like a scientific way, I guess. And so
Hmm.
I really appreciated that. How about you?
I remember reading other science fiction books growing up. Like when I first started reading, I read Dune, and
Mm,
I heard that described as science fiction. And I think it cheapened the real experience because I read it and it was like an ecological drama. It was
mm,
so full. And for a while, I thought that science fiction couldn't exist within the boundaries of like observing hard science fiction rules. And as much as I love Frank Herbert and all of his works, we very casually jump 2000 years in the future and the past, and there's not a lot of attention to how culture and society and technology, especially, would have changed. And that's something that you definitely do get with the Three Body Problem with Sishin's work.
definitely. I think that's sort of some of my favorite parts. Like when in the second book when Lil G wakes up, 150 or 200 years later, and like the world's just like crazy. But then he realizes like, oh, it's not that great. Like, of course we have inductive charging already, and just some of that's some of my favorite parts of the whole series.
So it sounds like you like some of the playful aspects.
Yeah, yeah, that I like that, and I mean, I pretty much adore like the entire series. I think my actual favorite part of the entire series is probably the fairy tales in the third book.
Oh man.
Like that was just like blew my mind. Like it was my mind was already blown by that time, but I was like it was blown even more, especially like when they spend like so much time afterwards, like trying to decipher them and like thinking about like how to do that.
That was so rich. I'm actually
Yeah.
wondering, I think I have a somewhat of a more laissez-faire approach to reading this. Like I suggested, we first met in on Reddit, on a Reddit thread that I learned was controversial because I actually suggested that new readers just like skip the first 80 pages and here's the spoiler for what you need to know. You need to know that, cultural changes can affect entire civilizations. And I gave my own summary, and a lot of people are like, no, you need to keep the work intact.
Mm.
And I have similar thoughts about the third book, which, like you, is my favorite. But I think if someone didn't want to start, I'm actually holding, the third book is near me. It's pretty hefty. If you
Yeah.
haven't held it, just listen. I first listened by audiobook, but it's a hefty book. I actually think that there's a series of little vignettes in the third book that could be read pretty much standalone. And one of
Mm.
them is the fairy tales. I mean, there's so much, they're elevated by knowing why they're in the third book. But my other suggestion was that someone could read if you remember the story of Gao Wei and the microscopic black hole.
Yep. Yep.
I also
Yeah,
think that
the
someone
in
could read
the
that
sphere, right?
standalone. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Because it's like interesting existential questions that are observed under these like real life conditions. For that
yeah.
one, and then the fairy tales are just a gorgeous piece of writing that you don't expect. That's definitely a treat.
And especially to me when I read it, it was like I know it was a coded message, right? So like I'm trying to
Hmm.
figure out like what the code is as I'm trying to read it, and then like
Yeah,
then you get the experience of like the whole world trying to figure out what the code is.
exactly. And we know, like, from having been trained, like, for literary devices, like, oh, something has to foreshadow, or there's some reason this must be brought up more than once. Like, he wouldn't bring it up if that weren't important. So even though you know it's important, it's still so exciting to try and figure it out along the way.
It reminded me of in The Sopranos they have a bunch of like dream sequence episodes and like they're really like abstract and like there's a lot of like symbolism that kind of stuff and those are always like my favorite episodes because like you're trying to like look for ways that like that fits into the story and it's similar here.
Mm. Are they like high concept episodes, or do
Yeah,
they,
it's like
you
entire
know,
episodes are just dream sequences or there's an episode like where he's in a coma and so like
that is so
yeah,
cool.
it's really good, and it's later on in the series, but it reminds me of like those kind of symbolic. If I remember right, like 6 Feet Under, that TV show, they also did a lot of like the symbolic dreams and that kind of thing. So I'm really into that kind of stuff, and so the fairy
Mm.
tale stuff really resonated with me.
It's a reward, I guess, for getting that deep in. Did you have any questions that you felt were unanswered or unresolved, either in a good way or a bad way, after finishing?
I talked to other people about this too, and I think the only thing would be, towards the end of the third book when they're actually on like Planet Blue, or Planet Green or whichever, on the other planet,
Right, right, right.
and like they talk a lot about like the world and how it's really dangerous now, and how information is like your location is like super secret, and like you're not, it's really a taboo to give that up. I would have seen like that world built up, like that part of it built up a little more, but that's the
Mm.
only thing I can really think of off the top of my head. How about you?
Someone was commenting on Reddit, like, I'd say you have to be smart to like these books, but I'm dumb as shit, and I still love them. And I think it rings kind of true to my understanding about the fairy tales, like specifically when we're talking about the brother of the princess and how he doesn't obey the laws of perspective.
Mm,
And I thought that was so interesting, to be used as a device, but I never really understood what it was supposed to indicate to humanity, like how that seemed to be like an edge and a way to defeat this super powerful civilization. And I didn't know what that anchored to. And when we talked about Singer's coordinates, I love that little chapter as
oh
well,
yeah,
actually.
definitely.
Just like he just like drops us in media res, which I think is a brave and admirable choice as a writer to just like give your audience just enough, but not too much. And we see that he talks about like medium membrane and primitive membrane and says like if we found short membrane communicators, they would be akin to gods, and that's never explained, and I'm wondering if it has to do with like ways to manipulate the membrane of the entire universe, and I'm wondering if like finally at the end of the book has that been achieved? Have we seen the first like short membrane broadcast?
Maybe, yeah. It could be like something with space time or something, or like because like the curvature propulsion like actually like bends time, space, right? So maybe it's something like that.
Mm.
And so that doesn't seem to be. I guess it does seem pretty prevalent in like the new society where like they have the death lines and stuff. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure either. So do you have like a more like scientific background yourself? I find the reason I ask is because like I have a computer science background, and I find like that kind of
Hmm.
thinking helps me kind of understand this. I thought it did anyway. Help me understand like these
Hmm.
things better. So do you have like a sort of scientific background or not, or did that help you?
Well, I'll say two things. One is that I do think it's exemplary when you can see someone doing something that they really enjoy.
Mm,
Like when you see a mathematician talking about the way that she really loves and like sees the beauty of pure math, even if you don't see it yourself. That's really interesting, like seeing a musician just gush about like what they
yeah.
do. And I think we see a lot of that because Liu Cixin definitely loves the hard science fiction, and even if it's not maybe every reader's preference to hear about how we're like changing the core of Mercury and how it would be sucked in. And trust me, I've calculated all these like propulsion. You can tell that he cares about
Yeah.
it, and that in itself is really satisfying. But since you asked about me specifically, yeah, I have a degree in
Mm.
biostatistics, and I did some computer science and machine learning after school. I'm not sure if that is what contributed. It possibly could be. What did you like about it from your background from thinking the way that a computer scientist is trained to think?
Yeah, I mean, like initially, like when in the first couple of chapters when they actually make the human computer, like it just draws you in because like how that stuff works, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
it's like, oh yeah, it's like I agree with you. Like it is interesting to like I watch YouTube videos about musicians like talking about music theory and that kind of stuff. I have no idea what they're talking about, but it's cool to watch, right? And
I like
so
their funny words, Magic Man.
yeah. So like when you actually like you can see how he like understands like how computer science works and how computers work at a really fundamental level in like a really interesting
Hmm.
storytelling mechanism. That kind of stuff draws you in. And then you can just kind of fully appreciate like he knows what he's talking about when it comes to radio transmissions or
Mm.
space time or physics, the laws of physics as it applies to light speed.
That's a really good point. Yeah, about like just the building of the first like logic gates. I
Yeah,
do remember that actually. Now you're reminding me of being like very satisfying. So it's like, oh yeah, you need to understand at like a really primary level. And it
right.
ends up being that's what humanity has to turn back to because they don't get like super advanced high tech, they don't get quantum computing. And so like maybe it depends on really knowing your basics and really understanding them.
So you said you listened to some of the audiobooks. Is that how you consume the entire series, or did you kind of mix it up?
Great question, because when you listen to the audiobooks, you miss the footnotes, and the footnotes
Mm,
are not not insignificant, especially for Anglophone readers like us.
mm.
I read the first book, and then I, like you, was doing a really really long drive, and I'd definitely like to hear about that, maybe off the air. We can swap commute stories. But I was driving down to Georgia this last Senate runoff election. I live up here in the East Coast, and I was driving down to go volunteer. And Georgia is about 10 hours from where I live. So I was like, wow, I've just started this audiobook. I hope it's good. And that's how I listened to the second, and of course became so absorbed. I was
Mm.
pretty busy with the work down there, but on my drive back, I also listened to the third. So I read the first one, and I'm currently in the process of going back and rereading in paper.
Okay, so do you have so you're reading like the actual like hard copy?
Right now, yeah,
Oh, okay.
I'm mostly skimming and like checking the footnotes and seeing, you can tell that he writes honoring like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, and sometimes that's pointed out. If you're already familiar with those works, maybe you don't need it, but we all like a reminder.
Yeah, I listened to the audiobooks for the first and second one on my first pass through, and then I ended up like using the ebook to read the third book. But now I've
Hmm.
gone through and done like all three for all three books, especially
Oh
as a
yeah.
for the podcast now. Like I've gone back. I've definitely read the entire thing three whole times, like straight through, and then like as we do the podcast, like reading sections by sections as well.
Has any guest ever said anything that makes you like reconsider or go back and reread?
There's been a lot of interesting perspectives. Like my first guest was Chinese and had a lot of perspectives from reading the Chinese version. And maybe you have also experienced. I don't know if you did you read it in Chinese or you just read it in China.
I don't have a Chinese copy. I have a PDF, which I do sometimes compare back and forward.
Mm,
Um, and I just see some interesting things. I'm sure your Chinese guest caught all of them, but there are some translations of names that are suggestive.
yeah.
Um, and I think that's interesting, but the prose is very similar. Of course, I get curious when it's a good thing there are no spoilers. Like at the end of Yun Tianming and IAA's life, when they've carved into rock, I was just thinking, like, I wonder if those, did he imagine those as letters or as characters? And
Oh
I'm,
yeah.
pretty curious about that.
Yeah, he had mentioned, and he's also like a very frequent poster on Reddit. You've probably seen like a lot of his stuff. I think his name is Pink Tie, some numbers. I forget
Mm,
what it is, but he has a lot of interesting perspectives about the differences between the Chinese version and the American version, or the English versions. He had talked a lot about like the ships
mm,
having like interesting names as it relates to like Chinese history, and he had also said like I forget like one of the wall facers plans was totally different. Like the swarm one and the
mm.
second book was different and kind of dumbed down in the English version for some reason because it had to do with like ball lightning. And I don't he didn't know why that got removed, but maybe it says
Interesting.
the book. I'm not sure, but it also seemed like pretty faithful, more or less. Yeah, just like those slight differences. And I think like you probably just catch more detail and like more of like nuance when you read in the original Chinese, because that's how he's thinking about it too. And yeah, probably you're right. He probably was thinking of Chinese characters on the in the rock and on Pluto too.
It's just because Chinese is just so concise. It's
Yeah.
really, if you've seen like when they give out documents at the UN, you know, the Spanish version is several stapled pages, the English one is shorter, the Chinese one is often like a single page, just because it's so, you know,
Yeah.
conservative,
Right.
and classical Chinese even more so. But those are sort of like deep and unimportant questions. They're a little too nerdy for affecting the actual outcome of the story. I did see that the ship names, at least if we're thinking of the same ones, they seem like they're all significant even in English.
I think I mentioned specifically like the Tang and had to do with like the Tang dynasty. And so that had some, I forget exactly what it was, but it had like some more
Mm.
historical significance where a person who knows Chinese history would have known like this had a more significant name than probably a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans who will read Chinese sci-fi will know that there's a Tang dynasty, but like me, like I won't know like when that was or what what they
Right
accomplished or
after the Sui, right after the Sui dynasty came the Tang. Now you know.
So yeah, I guess like in general, like what are some of your favorite moments that like when you think of like the entire series, like what moments stick out to you?
Oh boy, I think probably like the moments right after the dimensional strike is like is sent to Earth, and they like know that it's happening and know that it's true.
Hmm.
That part I had to reread. I thought it exposed a lot of, you know, what was already. I had someone tell me that like a crisis doesn't build character, it just reveals character.
Hmm.
And what we saw is like it revealed some people, like the authorities who claimed that they would stay there and they wouldn't try to run. And it also showed a lot of people who knew they couldn't escape and still ran for it.
And then they also get mad when they see like that ship can go light speed, you know, shoot it down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the ship that achieved light speed wasn't like flown by opportunistic people. It was flown by people who first suggested going back to the Earth.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting. And that's like one of the few moments. I think the a lot of like credit goes to the translator. I think it was very easy to read. It didn't feel clunky like some bad translations do.
Hmm.
Either Joel Martinson or Ken Liu, depending on which version you're reading. But there's sometimes when the Chinese fleet are speaking to each other that you can tell they're communicating in idioms, which are called chengyu in Chinese. And they're like four character sayings that are often imbued with like a lot of history.
Hmm.
And they repeat back and forth to each other, like falling leaves want to return to the root, which is said when they want to go back to Earth, and is also said when I can't remember which ship, but the ship that is not so lucky and doesn't escape into deep space that comes home thinking that they're heroes.
Oh, right. I think that
Yeah,
was that natural selection? I forget. It's or blue space.
or
Uh,
blue space or
yeah.
bronze age. Bronze
Right.
age, I think maybe.
Maybe.
Um, yeah, so part of the tragedy is that like they've come so far, and this Chinese idiom is that like that's where you should belong, is like everyone returns to their ancestral home, and they've traveled across space and time and they want to return home, and part of the tragedy is that they never get to.
Hmm.
So that's the part that I felt was a lot more weighty in Chinese, but I still remember it fondly in English. I don't know. I also just like the culminations, like seeing all of humanity's fleets destroyed when Zhang Beihai reveals himself, and just contemplating what it would be like to live in a world with different dimensions, whether that's more or fewer, is
Yeah.
always really interesting. For a computer scientist, it's really easy to add dimensions, but here in physics, in the real world, it's challenging for us.
Right. One of the experiences I had when I read the first book was when I first read the Project Sophon chapter. It blew my mind. And I was like, "What are they even talking about?" And I had to like go back and like re-listen to it like immediately after I heard it because I was like, "I don't." It's just like so much all at the same time. How did you feel when you first? Because I think feel like that's the first really like super scientific chat. I mean, there's
Sorry, which chapter?
the when the Trisolarians are explaining the Project Sophon.
Oh man,
Yeah.
that blew my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that was definitely something I went and reread, and that's why I would like pester people to read. I was like, no, no, you have to read because I want to talk about the end.
Right.
And what that meant is like, I want someone to explain the end to me. Yeah, so they open not Is it a fundamental particle that they open, or?
They say it's a proton that they unfold into, from 11 dimensions, and they unfold it into two. But they mess up a couple times too, right? Like they accidentally turned it into
Yes,
one dimension, and a bunch of strings come down.
which is a problem.
Yeah.
Yes. I thought it was so interesting when they, discovered that there's sentience or some kind of intelligence on
Yeah.
every scale, because it really just is the first time that we get a peek at like how small Cixin Liu at least views, Earth's current view of civilization and of space. And then it's not that our technology necessarily or naivety is limiting us. It's like our own arrogance. We think like, oh, there couldn't possibly be anything in a proton. There couldn't possibly be anything in space if we haven't seen anything. That I found was really interesting, that their like propaganda minister realized the potency in that and was like, you better publish that so we know that civilizations are everywhere. So destroying Earth is no big thing.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, that's funny. Like they're like, oh well, we do it all the time, so it's fine.
Yeah. But also just like the pure logistics of it. I also, like you, I really liked when they were first building those gates in
Mm,
the three body game. And they sort of hand waved, because I don't know what the Trisolarians look like, but they hinted that they have like reflective bodies. That means that they could communicate at like close to the speed of light, I think.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because if you've ever done this, and I know I've done it like when I teach or when I'm in like computer science 101, we do like raise our hands and create AND gates, but they're
Oh, really?
so criminally slow.
Yeah,
Um, there's a way around it. But you can't use like any circuitry if you're on the scale of a proton. And I think it's our first clue about their absolutely advanced technology, that they actually make their circuitry by bending the strong nuclear force.
yeah.
So if you're a keen-eyed reader, it should be no surprise that they have like strong nuclear force as a fundamental matter that they can build with.
Oh, yeah, and that shows back up as the drop later on when they talk about the strong
Hmm.
interaction material. Yeah, that's interesting.
Exactly.
I didn't catch that. So that's interesting. Do you have any favorite characters that from the series?
I kind of want to, yeah, talk about the third book,
Hmm.
because I don't think there is really a strong protagonist in the first book. I think it sacrifices a lot for plot and has really exciting plot, but I don't think people have strong opinions about Wang Miao.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, he's just sort of like the
Um,
audience foil, right? Like
yeah,
he's just the guy who's like he's taking all the stuff in. I think in the only really formed character in the first book would be Wen Jie, and she's not the protagonist. I mean, I don't know if she
mhm.
would say the antagonist. It depends on your point of view, I guess, but she's definitely the
She's
most.
some kind of catalyst.
Yeah,
I mean, her actions are seen from tens of millions of light years away by
yeah,
these super intelligent civilizations. So you could say that like she makes the most impact, but
yeah.
as a character, not really.
Well, I don't know. For the entire series, I would probably consider her the most fully formed character. Just like with the chapters where she
Hmm.
goes like in the where she goes to that small village and like
The
interact, and then
village,
she
yeah.
kind of like thinks like, is this really like maybe I should really shouldn't have done this. But then she goes and see like her mother, and like her mother is like all
And it
about
like
like
strengthens her
yeah,
initial resolve.
and she's like, all
Yeah.
right, forget it. Like, I did the right thing.
Yeah, that's right. Like, actually, no, just double down. That's
Yeah,
fine. I would agree. I think maybe she doesn't get all of that in the first book, but over the whole series, yeah, she definitely gets filled out
yeah,
as a character. And we meet her as a grandmother, but then, we travel through her whole life. But I feel like people have pretty strong um opinions about the character in the third book, that is
yeah,
like a more polarizing one. What do you think about
yeah, definitely, yeah.
about Chongqing?
I was actually pretty surprised. I'm really against spoilers, so like I really didn't like read anything about the books until I was finishing the entire series because I didn't want to know. Because I was definitely hooked
Hmm.
after the first one. I was like, I don't want to know what happens because I know it's a trilogy. I'll just read it. So when I went back and read it, I was really surprised. Like there's so much hate, levied at her. Like I liked her character, and and the dynamic between her and AA, where I thought was really good, and I liked that how they changed it from two kind of nerdy scientist. Like I guess Luigi is not like a nerdy scientist, but like I can see Wang Miao and Luigi being like very similar, right? Like they're
Yeah.
the same kind of mold. Different perspectives, but definitely like this, two youngish guys who are impacting the kind of nerdy, right? But then like you kind of change that dynamic entirely, and then you get Changxin and A in the third book, and and it really she's really representative of like the good part of humanity, but
Yeah.
the it's kind of our downfall with our being naive, right? And and too trusting, and so it kind of goes against the dark forest theory and everything. So I don't know. I really liked her character. I get why there's some pushback around like especially misogyny. I guess I didn't pick up on that either when I first read it either. Um,
Mm.
but I don't know. I guess when I first read it, I didn't pick that up, but maybe I wasn't looking for it that strongly. I just really enjoyed her character.
Yeah, I also was pretty surprised at anyone hating the third character. I didn't get that at all because I thought she like always adhered to her principles, and that's something we, you know, admire in ourselves and in others.
Yeah,
And like you said, she represents the good part of humanity, and ultimately like that's who humanity chose. So maybe there's something redeeming about the civilization that chose her. And I've seen a lot of theories that are like, no, they knew that she'd be weak, and the Trisolarians intentionally tried to feminize Earth so that they would choose someone weak. But it
yeah,
kind of all falls apart because she like has been around since before they started doing any kind of cultural exchange. Like she's been herself. And I like the little notes that she ends up that she was adopted. So that's kind of a break in normal Chinese tradition where so much is normally important for being patrilineal and patriarchal and patrilocal. And her family, like, they have their last words and they're not sappy and it's not protracted. It's just like, love brought us together. And then she leaves and goes into the future without them. But she carries that love with her
hmm.
for the rest of her life.
I would have considered her one of my favorite characters, like just because she's so different from what you'd expect from that kind of book, and so it's told the story from a very very unique perspective. Then, especially after reading the first two books.
Yeah, I was impressed that he could write her, frankly. Um, I don't know if I would label it misogyny, but I did find, like in the second book, Luoji's,
Yeah,
like his image, that was like difficult to read. It
right.
sort of was like a little immersion breaking. I was like, why are
Yeah.
we spending so much time here when there's so much exciting like work to be done?
In our podcast, we're going to be starting Dark Forest in the next couple weeks, and I'm kind of dreading that part, like because my friends hadn't read that part, and I was like, all right, there's not really a reason. I mean, it's mostly just building Loji's character, and yeah, it's not a great representation for a women, and
Oh,
like,
Dan, I can't wait to see how you navigate that.
so it's like I know, but just
Because you're
hold on.
introducing it, so you have to like be the apologetic.
Yeah. It was like just wait to the third. Like the second book is really good. Like the third book is amazing. So, but there are problematic parts in that. And I think there's like, and not only that, I think the second book is probably like my least favorite of the three. Not because it's
Mm.
not good, but because like there are problematic parts like that. And I think that, and there's also a lot of at the beginning of the book, there's a lot of characters who are introduced that we never hear from again, like the kind of ancillary
Yeah,
characters who are in the world.
that is the real Achilles heel of this writing. That
Yeah.
I think also turns off Anglophone readers who are like, I have to remember Ding Yi and Wang Miao and Yuan Chao. And are they going to be important? Do I need to take notes? Because I've definitely seen a lot of character names.
Yeah, but not only that, but like the people in the beginning of the second book are just like random people, and like I think they're related to some people, like in like the people that Dasher's like son eventually scams there and
Hmm.
there, and like but we never hear from them again afterwards, and they kind of just die off after Lochi goes to the future, right?
Yeah, I understand why they're there. Like, humanity is still desperate and still desperate to like
Yeah,
one of the first pursuits of humanity in, the most ancient of Chinese culture, like several thousand years BCE, is pursuing immortality. And people have been doing this kind of crazy stuff for the last 4,000 years. Like, oh, I bet the aliens are going to dig me up, so I'll get around that and I'll shoot myself into space. And like, I understood what it was trying to demonstrate, but I agree. It could have been done without so much belaboring the reader kind of early on in the second book.
yeah, it's just like a whole set of new people. The book opens with like Ye Wenjie, right, and talking to Loji, and it's like, all right, I know her, like I got it, like that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but then like after the prologue, it just like totally changes to like all these people you never heard of. It's like and as an American reader, they're all in Chinese names, so it's kind of hard to keep them all straight sometimes. So
It can be.
yeah,
And it's not like when we first opened with the ant, you're actually I look forward to, joining you on the Dark Forest and your podcast because I thought that it was a really cool opening to have this ant crawling and see like
yeah,
how the ant's perspective of time is like, oh, eons and eons of this and billions of years like that.
right,
And,
right,
once again forcing humanity to see itself as like, huh, bugs.
right,
But
right,
does that necessarily mean like we have no chance? Because they've been around for so long.
right,
I do
right.
think that I didn't mind, even though that's like quote unquote a new character.
Oh,
But
that part's fine. Yeah, I think that's like
yeah,
kind of more high concept. Like this is yeah, but if it was like it reminds me of I don't know if you read the Song of Ice and Fire series, the Game of Thrones books, but like they have entire chapters of like Bran as a wolf or something, and those are intolerable.
oh no, everything should come with a reader's guide. Like Dan approves of these chapters only. This next one could be a pricey, and we could keep going, especially because, and I promise the last thing I'll say on Lord G's like embarrassing weird fantasies. It seems like he really puts us through all of that for somewhat little payoff. Like
Yeah, yeah,
he gets the girl, and then eventually the girl picks up and leaves him, and then he remembers it 200 years later. But I just feel like there are more elegant ways to show that he's like a playboy, just pursuing like his own hedonistic desires.
yeah. I talked to somebody also about like maybe the character, if I remember right, was the Zhong Yan, if I remember right, Zhuang Yan.
Zhuang Yan.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, but like if she had like more of a character arc, because she's basically just at the beginning just like a fantasy for Loji, right? And at the end, and then later on, she's just a prop for the UN to tell Loji to do something, right? Like we're gonna take her away, and then you need to do something, or else you're not gonna get her back.
yeah.
But then like she has no other agency besides that, so I would have liked to see that
She
a little bit
really is
more.
just property. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not like she has. I mean, she teaches him a little bit about painting, but
right.
that's not a character.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the theories that that someone had mentioned to me is like maybe like she's actually an agent, and so she had been like set up the whole time to actually like push him towards actually like doing his, because I knew about his shortcoming, his personality of like being lazy and not really
I
wanting to
will
do anything.
I
So
will say book 2 is the only one that got a real, like, honest laugh out of me. Like, I stopped the podcast to laugh. Um, 'Cause it's kind of a somber book, even though it's really enjoyable.
hmm,
It was when Luoji was telling the UN basically like, I want this house and I want it next to these mountains and I want it to be perfect in every way and I want to live like an aristocrat and I want to be completely alone and I want to have all my needs met and manservants and butlers. And then also, we'll talk about this, mail order bride.
right.
And they take down his notes and the guy, sort of in a moment of candor, is like, "Hey, thanks. Yours is the cheapest plan so far. Money is a real headache."
Yeah, he doesn't need to mine mercury or whatever.
Well, yeah, it's before we've seen what other people's plans are, so it's
Yeah.
sort of like, "Uh-oh, like what have we gotten ourselves into?"
Yeah, and like, you can justify it with like that's part of the plan. Don't worry. Yeah, it's a wall facer. Yeah, wall facer
All part of
privilege.
my plan.
So do you have any other favorite characters from the series?
Hmm. I wouldn't say it was like that character driven for me. I do
Yeah,
definitely admire the transformation of a couple characters. Like I think Da Shi is introduced, Captain Shi. He's like supposed to be a little off-putting, and I really grew to admire him and like the way he was, saving Luoji and
yeah,
keeping really steady. Um, so I think he had like a nice little character arc,
yeah.
but obviously the most beautiful was Yun Tianming.
Were you disappointed that him and Changxing were able didn't actually meet up in the end, or did you find it? It's not rewarding, but it's like a rewarding in like a literary way. That like they
Oh,
come
I was
so close.
devastated.
Yeah,
What do you expect?
yeah.
Like that moment of like we missed them.
Right. Yeah, it's like they're so
Um,
close, like they could like see them down there, and like, oh no, we just got caught for millions of years or whatever they were in the death lines.
I think yeah, I mean, we experience that in quotidian ways. There are opportunities that seem so close. But there's also There's like so much foreshadowing and so much precedent. Like when Luoji is at the Earth Tomb, which is also just like a wonderful little
Yeah,
journey we take in the third book. At the mausoleum, he's like looking at the wall and saying, here's where the Qin dynasty was. And the Qin was a tiny, I'm going to do a brief, like 30-second Chinese history lesson,
sure.
and then I'll be done. It was a tiny state during the Warring States in China, and it adopted a principle of legalism, of like assigning really understandable but very strict codes and laws to everything. Like you steal something, chop off your hand.
Hmm.
Doesn't matter intent, doesn't matter anything. You pay homage to the king 10 times, you get promoted. Everything is regulated by rules. And one of the problems with a system that's entirely regulated by rules, can you think of any?
I don't know.
Assuming the rules are like just and correct.
I mean, science, I guess, right?
Well, like one problem is like it's completely amoral. It
Hmm.
doesn't matter if someone's doing the right things for the right reasons.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and this understandably kind of scared everyone else in what was China back then in like 300 BC. And they all decided to stop being at war with each other and, combat the Qin. And the Qin swallowed them all,
Hmm.
swallowed them all whole,
Hmm.
and grew to be this like giant tyrannical dynasty. And Luoji, so history lesson is over. Luoji is noticing that this is happening at the same time as like, was it like Napoleon maybe or Alexander the Great?
I'm not sure.
A Western conquering hero
Hmm.
was around at the same time, and he's leading his armies this far to the east, and then they turn around. But like, what if they'd met? Wouldn't that have been like one of the best historical showdowns in all of history?
Yeah.
But it was just like a missed opportunity. They were so close, but it didn't happen.
Oh, yeah. Maybe Alexander the Great. I think he went pretty far east. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can just see. Yeah, it's Alexander the Great. At least his dates match.
Hmm.
He was around in 300 BC. So yeah, I mean, it was so close, and that was war, and this is love, but all's the same.
Right. Right.
And I think we're supposed to know that something like devastating is coming. If you remember when Chengxin wakes up in this like beautiful new world and sees that these pieces of art are actually made by aliens, like they're not even human, the novels that she's reading
Yeah. Yeah.
and the painting. Yeah, I mean that blew my mind as well as hers.
Right. Yeah, I mentioned that on the podcast as well. Yeah, talking
Yeah.
about like, or maybe it was on the spoiler cast, or I talked about it at some point where I must have been a spoiler cast because it happens later.
Hmm.
Yeah, like how like when she wakes up and then like they have not only like contributed art, but it's like winning awards. It's like winning the Oscar for Best Picture that year, and
I
they're able
know.
to
It's like
emulate the
punked.
yeah. I mean, and like their style is very arty and like yeah, like kind of beautiful. I mean, it seems like it's all part of like their master plan, right? To kind of lull humanity into a false sense of security, and then like they're ready to pounce as soon as like they're able to.
Oh,
Yeah,
instantaneously ready.
right.
Like they don't hesitate. They've definitely learned. But one of those great pieces of cultural reflection that so captures the attention of Chongqing is this love story about these two lovers who are like down the river from each other
Hmm.
and they don't get to meet. That's their great tragedy.
Oh, interesting. I don't remember that, but yeah, that's good foreshadowing.
I mean, I didn't see the foreshadowing until
Right.
after. And I was clawing through the pages looking for an explanation, but every time I read it, it just keeps turning out the same way. They
Right.
keep missing each other.
Yeah, it always
Yeah.
seemed like like Yun Teaming could have just like gone in the Pocket Universe. Like, well, I don't know, maybe it's like it wasn't big enough for. I mean, it seemed big enough for how many ever people they wanted, but
I think they sort of like did a little hand waving and like AA was always more interested in the world. So like
yeah,
maybe that's enough that like he loved AA or something.
yeah.
I don't
Maybe
know. Were you disappointed?
I was kind of disappointed, not disappointed, but I do like kind of the tragedy of them not meeting up. But I did want to see Changxin and AA get together again, and kind of talk
Of
about their
course.
experiences. It would be nice to see like more like yeah, if her and Yun Taming actually went out and like explored like the universe. Maybe that's a satisfying ending for her. But we don't know. I think there's I haven't read it, but I know there's like a what is it, the Redemption of Time? Have you read it?
I haven't,
Oh,
only because I haven't gotten my hands on it.
it's apparently like, it's not done by Liu Cixin. It's like some other guy. Like it's basically like people call it just fan fiction. But
Mm.
I heard it explains more about Yun Tin Ming and maybe some other stuff. But I haven't read it either. So maybe there's answers there, but it's not really canonical. So I don't know if it's be interesting to read. Have you read anything else
Yeah.
by Liu Cixin?
No, I've picked up Ball Lightning, but I've
Mm,
also heard people say like Three Body is his best work.
mm,
So you've kind of eaten dessert before dinner if you read his other
I see.
works. I would still be convinced if you would recommend any of them.
I haven't read any either. The only thing I've consumed is I've watched Wandering Earth, which is I think it's
Hmm.
a short story of his, but there's it was released in the U.S. I saw it there's like a Chinese community. I live in Los Angeles, and there's like a Chinese community here
Hmm.
that has like they show Chinese movies, so they were showing it in the original Chinese, but they had English subtitles. So I was
Oh,
able
that's cool.
to watch it. But now I think it's on Netflix now. And so maybe that was like the precursor to the TV show that's coming up. So that's the next topic I want to get into is like how familiar are you with the TV show, and are you excited about it? Are you apprehensive about it?
Yeah, I mean, we've had such a good discussion. I kind of wanted to turn our attention, here at the end to a more hairy question, which is like adapting it. What do we think? Is that like doomed? Is there reason to be hopeful about that? Is that even something you'd want to see?
So I'm of two minds about it personally. I
Mm,
want to see it adapt. I don't know how they're going to do it, especially the third book, right? It seems almost impossible to adapt. Like, how are they going to show the dimensional attack in a good way? That's a way that really resonates without looking cheesy. Or how are they going to talk about Project Sophon? Are they going to just dumb it down? I think we're in an era of television where they can give the audience a lot of credit. I'm thinking
mm,
like The Expanse is a really good TV show. I haven't read the books, but and I know like people have talked about it's really pretty faithful to the books. But there's also like a lot of like scientific concepts they don't like really dumb down and like talk you through, or like they give the audience credit, right? So hopefully like in this series they will give the audience credit for not explaining the really scientific
mm.
concepts, but and not just dumb them down. But I'm also a Game of Thrones book reader, and the creators or the showrunners for Game of Thrones are the same ones that's doing the three body problem, and I really didn't like what they did with the end of that show. They did a really great job about adapting the
Yeah,
material
can
they
I
had.
offer? Yeah, the only pushback I could offer to that is like the ones where they had to make it up on their own. I agree.
Yeah,
It was embarrassing for us all. But when they were adapting what was already written, like those
yeah,
were really, really good and
yeah. That's
maybe
what gives me
not
hope.
exactly faithful, but
Right.
a good representation. And of course, like when they go out on their own, they're just like not courageous enough to do what I think a work of this scale demands, because there are such sacrifices that happen.
Yeah, I think they're not good writers. I think that's a problem, right? Like yeah, like you said, like they're really good at adapting, and like the first like 3.5 or 4 seasons were excellent. Like every episode was great, and like, but they really were pretty faithful to the material with a few changes here and there for television. But that's fine. Television's a shorter
Hmm.
medium. Like I'm okay with like smaller changes, but like later on when Littlefinger's like warping between places, and like Daenerys is warping between places, and like they have like Sansa for
That's,
some reason,
yeah,
like
for
go
some
to Winterfell.
reason.
Yeah, like that kind of it didn't make sense, and it wasn't good story wise, right? Hopefully they stick the material and they give audience credit, and so I'm going to be cautiously optimistic and hope for the best.
Yeah, I think that some things will adapt really, really well to a visual medium like the fairy tales, because that can
Mm,
instantly, whatever style you've chosen, you can like transcend it and offer the audience something really, really different. You could cast like non-Chinese audiences if you need like big names and big faces in the US,
yeah,
um, because it's just like they're creatures of legend. I do worry about obviously the perils of adopting like a beloved story into a television show, and also because like once it gets through all the censors in China, will it even be the show that we want it to be? I could be just very hawkish, but if it comes out, I think I will watch it no matter what.
oh, for sure. Like there's no way I wouldn't watch it. I just watched the adaptation of The Stand that came out, and it's terrible. It's really really bad. But I watched it because like I'm a big fan of the book, so like even if it's terrible, I would still watch this show.
Let it never be said Dan is not loyal to the end.
I'm another kind of worry that's in the back of my mind is like they're gonna maybe try to over Westernize it because I think like American audiences are gonna have a hard
Yeah.
time with like all these American names. So is like is Wong Miao gonna get renamed to John Smith or whatever? Hopefully not, but like that could be a thing.
I sure hope not. I think obviously it helps if you're a little bit familiar, like Qin Shi Huang, the Shi Huangdi that we meet in Three Body Problem. Like he's a Chinese emperor, and that's cool to know. But there's also like Copernicus,
Yeah,
and you don't need to be Chinese or American to understand that that's a significant historical person. And so I think if they trust a little bit to an audience, they're not going to even realize that it's such a weird name. I think if it's
yeah,
just introduced and adhered to. I
and
mean, you just said the word Littlefinger and didn't even flinch. That's bizarre.
and another thing that I've talked about, I think I posted this on Reddit before too, that like
Hmm.
about Wang Miao, about how he just doesn't show up after the first book. I don't know how they're going to handle that, and like having like a separate main character for all three books, like that usually you're going to want like the star, right, to be the star throughout the whole entire thing, and like there's no one character that expand that
Well, we
spans
just
the
don't
entire
live long
series.
enough.
Yeah, yeah. So I wonder how they're going to handle that. Like one thing I was kind of worried about that they might do is like combine the characters of Wang Miao and Lo Ji. I mean, hopefully not, but like
Mm,
that I could see them doing it, right? Like
I
combining those
could
two
definitely
stories.
see that.
Yeah,
There's a lot of stuff that happens with Luoji that I think could be cut, um, which they might end up just like conflating characters. I mean, they could get around it with flashbacks, but
right.
again, you're right. I mean, like, just no one lives long enough to like faithfully be in all of them as the star.
And another thing they might do is like I saw someone else had this idea was that they might cut together the stories of Luo Ji and Qing Xin, like because they kind of happen simultaneously, but in different books, right? So
Hmm.
like maybe like
I
they do
think I'd be
cut.
okay with that.
Yeah, I would too. Yeah, kind of cut back and forth between them. It is really cool though to like see the when Chengxin later on like meets up with Luo Ji and he's like the old sword holder.
Oh,
Like
that's
that's
so
really
satisfying.
yeah. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
like yeah, Wang Miao and Loji both sort of have like that like nerdy, kind of creepy
Yeah, they're like
personality.
skulking academics and
Yeah.
they can be playboys, but they don't really, yeah, absolutely.
So, is there any other, based off of people who do like this book or this series, any other recommendations that you might have for things that you've read or watched or movie or any other media that people might also be interested in?
Yeah, it's been said before, but he didn't create this in a vacuum, and I think it's definitely worthwhile to read some Isaac Asimov since that was obviously such an inspiration for Cixin Liu. And Foundation is a great novel to start off with. He also wrote a lot of short stories. I don't know if they're available by audiobook, but they're they've been out long enough that you can just find them in the public domain now.
Yeah.
And it's nice to reconnect and realize that these like existential questions, which is what science fiction pushed to its limit gets down to, have been around for a long time. you know
Hmm.
I would
Yeah.
definitely recommend some old school science fiction.
Yeah, like I said, I've never been like a huge reader, so I never in high school I never like read a lot. So yeah, I've always meant to
Hmm.
get back to those stories, especially like yeah, given my appreciation for this series. Yeah, I'd want, and I've heard a lot of good things about the Foundation series, but I've always intended to go back to it and listen.
I mean, you watched The Expanse. That's pretty a lot
Yeah,
of investment. Did you watch Interstellar?
I did. It was great.
I think, yeah, that's also great for a different medium. I think it's more of an investment than reading the Foundations, just because Interstellar is so long and so deep. But I also felt that was pretty worthwhile.
How did you feel about the end of Interstellar? I know that's pretty polarizing.
Is it? I
I
mean, I think it could only end one way. Like at some point, we need to wrap up.
I mean, like specifically like the Tesseract when he goes into that and like the trying to like visualize like what four dimensional space would look like. I mean, maybe that's gonna be the problem of this series too. Like just trying to visualize like all this like dimensionality, like how they're gonna show it. Hopefully, not gonna fall into the same trapping, but I know that was pretty polarizing.
Yeah, people often explain dimensions, like when I would solve difficult math problems, it's a strategy that is really useful. Is like, can you make it simpler? Like if
Mm,
you're trying to isolate 3 points that are moving, that's hard. Try and see if you can isolate 2 points, and then see if you can, expand, because it can be so overwhelming. So I think if we could like somehow visually show the whole world in 2D and how limiting that is, because like everything is just different shaped line segments. If you have no depth, you can't see anything other than how long a certain line segment is,
yeah.
and then sort of use that to explain that's how limiting 3D feels to a 4D
Right.
creature.
Right.
So like we can't really show you 4D, but we can show you how horrific it would be if you had to like live here now.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of the chapters and when they're meeting with the four-dimensional spheres or the pockets, when they're in the deep space and they're going through those
Oh,
pockets and like
yeah,
they're like throwing like the body slices, but it's like doesn't hurt them. It's just like that's just how those pockets work, and so that's going to be also pretty difficult to visualize. I think it's hard enough to write about, much less
definitely.
visualize.
That's part I reread in Chinese. I was like, maybe this will make more sense.
Did it?
Nope.
Oh.
The fish, the bishop drive, the fish who did this have left. I was like, yep, says the same thing in Chinese. It's just as sad, it's just as deep. But yeah, so I agree. Like the ending of Interstellar could be polarizing, but it is really hard to represent a tesseract.
Yeah.
It's hard to even think about, much less like try and design.
Yeah, I thought I mean, overall, they did a really good job about explaining scientific concepts and in like in a understandable way. They talked about like the space time curvature of the pencil through the paper, and they talked about like the gravity like the extreme gravity causing time dilation. So like that stuff.
Hmm.
I mean, maybe I'm in that world, or I'm not in that world, but like I like that kind of media, so like it more resonated with me. But I felt like it's people could understand it in like a pretty consumable way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, do you have recommendations either that a guest has given and you agreed with or didn't agree with or have to give to me?
Yeah, so some of the things on my list is a lot of the Arthur C. Clarke books, because
Hmm.
he's really inspired by those. 2001 is definitely my favorite movie. So I've always wanted to go back and read like the book for it. I just never did. So that's one of the recommendations that stuck out to me. And then yeah, Asimov, people have mentioned that too. Yeah, I think in general, like I want to become a more prolific reader. I just never really had the attention span all the time, and unless I got really invested in the series, like this one or the Remembrance of or the Song of Ice and Fire series. Those are really long, but like you're invested in it, and like if anything, I'm a person I'm a completionist. So like if I start reading it and get involved in it, like I'll keep on it. So
Yeah. A really short book that I think does a really good job if you are looking to at least check another one off is Flatland. I don't know if you've read
oh,
that yet.
I did, yeah. That after I finished this series, like people kept recommending that, and so I went
You just
immediately.
had to.
Yeah, it was pretty short. Yeah, yeah, it's really good, really well written. My friend was saying that like there's actually like some also like kind of sexist overtones where like the women are portrayed in like a minimized way in that book. But it's
Yeah,
written in
for
1800s or
sure.
something.
It's also like only 100 pages long.
Yeah.
So, yeah, definitely I can't defend it as a perfect work, but I thought it just illustrated a really cool point, which is the end, you know, the sphere telling the little 2D guy, like, of course there are no higher dimensions. I'm the top. And it's like,
Right.
once again, like naivete isn't the impediment. It's like your arrogance, thinking that you'll be like, you're the top of the food chain. And that's sort of what gets in the way every time.
Yeah, and that's like it's a theme throughout this entire series, right? Where the humans like are constantly arrogant, like they're humbled, and then they get more and more arrogant, and then like the drop of the hat comes in, and like it's like, oh, of
It's
course we
hard
could,
not to be.
yeah.
I mean, like Chongqing says, like I'm going on and on, but the reason that she became like an astrophysicist, and she is like a scientist and kind of a hero, even though she's like an academic nerd. The reason she went in is because humanity went to the moon, and then like she wakes up later and she's taking a super short trip, and it's 5 times the length of like humans going to the moon. And
Yeah.
you see that, and you see how fast human ships can travel. And if your perspective is like it's only been 100 years since we stopped using human labor as a primary labor, Like it seems like we're unstoppable, but it's just because we started here and like our arrogance could lead us to say like no one's above us. But again, the themes of the book keep saying that that's not true.
Yeah, over and over again. Like, yeah, they get really arrogant about the droplet attack. They get really arrogant about like the bunker defense, right? It's like, oh yeah, okay, we got it. Like they're gonna send the photon. Nope.
Yeah. I love that also, like, it took years and, like, trillions of dollars to build the bunker world, and
Right.
everyone invested in it, and then if we see the chapter of the guy's like, "Huh, I'm gonna flick a photo. Oh, never mind." And then
Yeah.
he, like, flicks something else, and the whole thing, like, it doesn't even interrupt his song. It's, like, some
Right.
so low effort, what took humanity so much effort to try and construct.
Yeah. But at least we were interesting enough where we got a nickname of the Star Pluckers, right? Like we have that
Yeah,
for
that's
us.
very sweet. We have the respect of the galactic community, and we have a cute nickname,
Right.
so, I mean, that's not a bad ending.
Right. Okay. Well, anything else that you want to talk about?
Yeah, and if you're interested in following what my group and I do, I was commuting down to Georgia um, to build strength in numbers and revive classical organizing, which we thought was needed in 2020. But it's a brand new world, and we still need it. So that movement is called Math Movement. I'm a mathematician,
Mm.
biostatistician by training, but that's political organizing. That's Math Movement on all social media. We're a little bit more active on Twitter and Reddit. But yeah, otherwise you'll see me, crawling around the Remembrance of Earth's Past subreddits and, debating these ideas a little bit further.
And what's your name on the subreddit?
On the subreddit, I'm 8bakes.
You can reach us at rehydrate@fastmail.com or on Twitter at rehydratepod. So, Talia, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciated our conversation.
It was really nice to speak with you. Thank you so much for everything you brought down.
Thanks, and thanks for listening.